And welcome back to Bridge the Gap. My name is Jessica Leichtweisz, and I'm the CEO of Hope Education Services. I've been working with kids with autism for 12 years, and what I found is there's a big disconnect in the autism community. Oftentimes, autism professionals are not on the same page as parents, and parents are not on the same page as adults with autism. And so the purpose of this show is to have open and honest conversations about what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, so we can come together as a community and make sure that kids are being served in the best way possible, and that we don't repeat mistakes that have been made today. So I'm so excited to bring a guest on the show today. Her name is Rosie Weldon. She's going to share a little bit about her story and her experience having autism. So Rosie, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for asking me on. I think it's important what we're talking about. So yeah, it's good.
It's my pleasure. So you told me that you have a diagnosis of autism. Just to bring everybody on the same page, can you just share with everyone, when you got that diagnosis and a little bit about your journey with that?
So I was diagnosed at 25. I was diagnosed in my second year of uni, which I did later on as a mature student. So I was 24 when I started uni. And it was that independence and sudden need to stand on my own 2 feet and not hide behind my siblings or my best friend at school or my mum that saw me kind of crash. And then people realized, well, somebody said that I lacked eye contact, and it was that spurred me to think, well, I know what that means. I knew enough about autism to know that was a sign. And then I went down the route and got the diagnosis literally off the back of somebody saying I didn't have eye contact, and it all started making sense from there.
Yeah, and it's amazing because a lot of the guests I bring on the show, like yourself, were diagnosed as adults. They weren't diagnosed as kids. And a lot of parents ask me every day, is the number of new cases of autism real? Is there really is it really 1 in 54 as of in the United States, and the new numbers just came out 1 in 54 today, whereas 30 years ago it was 1 in 10,000. And I don't think so. I think that more people are being diagnosed. Would you agree with that?
I think it's good. I do not think it means there's more autistic people. I think it means there's more understanding, there's more awareness. Even my mum will say, should I have realized, should I have picked it up? And she looks back and she can see all the signs, but she didn't have that awareness to be able to put 2 and 2 together. And the more awareness, and I think it means the community is doing the right thing. We're doing a good job. We're raising awareness. People are seeking a diagnosis, and especially women and girls are getting more diagnoses. So I don't see why people say that's a bad thing, personally. I think it's good that people are getting the label, which leads to the support.
Yeah, absolutely. And, girls are often overlooked. And I'm glad that you brought up about women getting the diagnosis. Boys that have autism, they tend to present differently, or autistic boys, autistic girls. And you'll hear, as a habit, I tend to use, I get person first language, where in the autistic community tends to like identity first language. And that's an adjustment for me as a professional to even do. And I make an effort, but I still have to always be cognizant of what I'm saying. But, autistic boys, they tend to present differently than autistic girls, especially at a young age. Autistic boys tend to be louder. They tend to be more hyperactive. I'm making generalizations, of course, but they tend to get in trouble a lot at school. And whereas autistic girls tend to be very quiet. They tend to be very structured. They like to follow rules. Girls are usually very intelligent. I think generally women are more intelligent than men, but that's a whole nother topic. So, girls tend to be the teacher's pet, and they tend to just get overlooked and forgotten by the system because the struggles that oftentimes autistic girls have are more silent and less visible. And so the support is not there. So does that sound like you as a child? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so for you as a child, did you, looking back at it, what were some of the things, and I'm asking this for parents that are watching this and wondering whether or not they should seek out a diagnosis for their child. What are some of the things that you struggled with as a child that might have been overlooked that, you really wish you would have had the support for?
I think the biggest thing was, for girls especially, you can have a best friend, and it wasn't weird that they communicated for me, and I went everywhere with them, and I didn't go to the toilet without going with my best friend, and I didn't go to a new room without going with my best friend. That was normal for girls to do that, But if it gets to a point where a girl actually can't do it on their own, they can't go and find the bathroom on their own, or they can't go and ask for a drink on their own or order a menu on their own, then you should start thinking, well, okay, it's all good and well having her friend do it, but if she can't do it on her own, don't just label that as shyness, that the good girl can't do it, because actually it might be something a lot more. And at school, yeah, I was very well behaved and academically did very well, but and that kind of meant people were happier to just support me without questioning why I needed some of the support that I needed. And also, just to quickly point out, my younger brother, who's 9, yes, generally speaking, it's very different girls to boys. He has had countless teachers tell him that he's not autistic because he presents the same way that a girl that's autistic generally presents, and he's very inwardly facing. So don't also think that a boy that's very quiet and inwardly facing and well behaved and will not break any rules is not autistic either. There's different ways to present, and I think definitely the rule thing, I think I won't break any rules. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Like that, if a rule is there, I will stick to it, and my brain will implode at the thought of breaking that rule. So I think that's a big thing to look out for, is that need of black and white and finite in their life. If they cannot veer from black and white and having things a set way, it's probably quite a red flag, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you bring up about the fact that different people's autism presents differently, right? And we know the cliche, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But I also like the idea of you talking about, and I'm going to use the terms, and I don't use these terms, but I'm specifically going to bring them up to talk about this being an example of why we don't use them. But the high functioning autism versus low functioning autism, why those terms don't work. Because, you said your brother follows the rules and he's quiet and he's smart. And so people might look at him and say, well, his autism is high functioning and his autism experiences differently. Those labels of like high functioning, low functioning, that's not how a person experiences autism. That's how society experiences them experiencing their autism. And so it's really hard to say that. And just because you experience a person's autism mildly, that doesn't mean they're experiencing autism mildly. You can have a lot of struggles, and those struggles may be internal, and they may be things you don't see, but they're valid and they're important. And so I know you talked about the idea that once you get a label, you get support. And I know there's this big controversy of whether or not a label matters. And what I've found is that oftentimes parents want to avoid a label. And you and I talked about the fact that oftentimes parents and autistic adults are not on the same page. And your parents often don't want a label because they don't want a stigma attached to their children. And I always tell parents, listen, that's your own baggage that you have to get over. And that has nothing to do with your child. And I found that most often autistic adults, especially when they did not have that label, they found relieved and they found freedom in understanding really when, okay, you're autistic, it explained a lot. It gave them understanding, it gave them freedom. And also certainly today it gives you access to support that was not even available 20 years ago, but that you also still couldn't get today with having that label. For you, when you got your diagnosis, was that a moment of relief? Was it a moment of fear? How did you experience that?
I will honestly say that getting the autism label quite literally saved and changed my life. So prior to having it, I hated myself. I thought I was broken. I didn't understand why everybody else could do all these just simple things. To most people, the most frustrating thing about autism is the stuff that you can't do is normally the stuff that's so easy for other people to do. Just go and order that drink, go and walk into that room, go and talk to this person. And I was spending so much time not being able to do those things and hating myself for it. Like, why can't I just do everything everybody else can do? And then when they said you're autistic, everything started making sense. And I realized that it was a waste of energy hating myself for not being able to do those things, because if I wasn't built to do them, I wasn't built to do them. And yes, obviously I've learned coping mechanisms and I've put a lot into place, but that label was the beginning to the journey of me understanding myself and my family. Like, I had so many arguments with my parents and my family prior to the diagnosis, and after it, it's like we were on the same page, or at least going towards getting on the same page, because they understood meltdowns are a big one. How can you possibly not tell a kid off for having a meltdown behavior unless you know it's an autistic meltdown? And then please don't tell them off if you know it's an autistic meltdown. There's a big difference between a kid being naughty and their brain so misfiring that they can't cope. And knowing the difference between those two, for me and for everybody in my life, was absolutely life-changing. I think you need a label. And for work, I wouldn't have reasonable adjustments. There's no way I would have a job if I didn't have the label of autism. That's just a fact. I wouldn't be working without it.
Yeah, there's so much like that you brought up there that's so important. Before we move away from the subject, I do want to talk about meltdowns. It's something we talk about often on this show. And sometimes parents will ask me, how do I discipline my child with autism? Because I don't really know the difference between a meltdown and a tantrum. And there are times when I'm working with children, and I've been working with children for 12 years, and I'm classically trained as a behavior therapist, there's times when I don't even know for sure, is this child just in their terrible twos and being naughty, or can they truly not cope in the moment? And it isn't always going to be apparent for a parent. And I always err on the side of caution and tell a parent, if when in doubt, treat it like a meltdown, because it's not right. It's not ethically okay to treat it. If you're making the wrong decision, then okay, you're spoiling your 2-year-old. But if you're making in the event you treat it as a tantrum and it's really a meltdown, you wouldn't punish somebody who is wheelchair bound for not being able to get up and walk across the room. You can't punish somebody who's autistic for not being able to cope. I mean, this is something that happens neurologically, in the brain. And I always tell parents that we have a particular part of our brain called the reticular activating system. And what it does is it filters out sensory information. It filters out what's important. It tells us what to pay attention to. And a person who's typically developing has a typical response. So meaning that stimulation in the environment is processed the same way. So a light would be just as bright to me as it is to the person standing next to me if we're both typically developing in our ocular senses. But for someone with autism, it may be so bright that it's causing them physical pain, or they may not even be able to notice it, whether or not they're sensitive or whether or not they're hypersensitive or they're more aware, less aware of those senses. So what to you, because it's very rare to have the privilege of actually being able to have an autistic person communicate to a parent, what it actually feels like. And that's what their parents always want to know, is what does it feel like? If you have a meltdown, you can tell parents, what does it feel like to have a meltdown? And neurologically, even if parents understanding, it's different than understanding what a person's going through. So when you have a meltdown, what are you going through and experiencing?
So firstly, I'll say that telling the difference between a meltdown and a tantrum is probably the hardest part of parenting an autistic kid. And I don't envy anybody who happen to make that choice. I helped raise my little brother, and it's not an easy thing to figure out. But it's probably the most important part of parenting them to try and figure out. For me, meltdowns are for me the worst part of being an autistic adult, in terms of, I've had one at work a few months ago. And if anybody can even try and say that that was a choice as a 28-year-old professional accountant in the middle of the office, I'm going to choose to have a meltdown, that's ridiculous. There's no way I had any control over that. So that's the first thing to realize, is that autistic people do not control their meltdowns. And that's why you shouldn't tell them off, because when I come out the other end of it, I am so embarrassed and so exhausted, and I just want it all to go away and just don't talk about it, because I don't want to talk about it. But the build up, obviously, it's going to be different for different people. It depends whether it was sensory overload that's pushed you to it. I've had meltdowns over things being really subjective, and I can't get my head around it, and you're not explaining yourself, and I don't understand what I'm supposed to be doing, and then that blows out. But typically it just feels like your mind, somebody's holding the throttle down, it's going round and round and round and round and round, and round, and you just blow, like you just blow. And that's why I beg to parents, don't go and try and hug your child if they have a meltdown. And if you do, when they lash out at you, don't tell them off for that, because 9 times out of 10, an autistic person in meltdown doesn't want to be touched. Don't touch them. And obviously, if they're in danger, or you need to sort that out. But generally speaking, for me and for my little brother, the best thing to do in a meltdown is to ensure our safety and to just let us ride it out, because we will come out the other end of it. But there's no cure. Nobody can come up to me once that meltdown is triggered. That's it. for me, you've just got to let it ride out. You've got to let us be safe. You can keep us calm. You can obviously remove us if it was sensory overload or something, remove us from the situation. But you've got to let our mind run its course and calm down, because it's essentially running on hyperdrive, and it's a horrible, horrible thing. We completely lose control. We're desperately trying to figure out our place and what's going on, and it's hard to even put into words, because it's just overwhelming at the absolute max. I don't think a non-autistic person could probably ever really understand as such.
Yeah, and I tell parents that all the time, is that as a professional, and that's one of my number one reasons for starting the show, I say, look, as a professional, I can teach you about autism. You know, I can teach you what the symptoms, signs of autism are. I can teach you the best way to teach your child to talk. I can help you to learn strategies for communicating with your child, but only an autistic person can help you understand autism, which is my number one reason for having this show. You know, I like how you talk about the fact that when a person's having a meltdown, you have to just leave them alone. And oftentimes I've seen parents trying to help a child cope. And as a parent, there is nothing harder than seeing your child in distress and not being able to help them. But sometimes as a parent, the best thing you can do is to back away. And sometimes that's what help looks like. And that's really hard. It's hard for parents sometimes to do nothing, and it makes you feel helpless. But sometimes it's the best thing you can do. It really truly is. It's the best thing you can do. And if someone is having a meltdown, from my experience, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, you know, especially if that meltdown is being caused by sensory information, even if someone means well and tries to help them, and even if they're trying to help them by doing things that they like, their body can no longer physically process any senses. Their sense of sight is not working properly. Their sense of hearing is not working properly. You know, they may be making noises and not be aware of it. They might be moving their body around, but they're not aware of it. You know, that's called proprioception sense. And we don't often talk about that because it's not one of the main 5 senses that people use, right? If I were to, I have an apple on my desk. If I were to smell it, that's intentional. I'm taking a deep breath and smelling my apple. If I bite it, I can experience, right, the taste of the senses of taste, the senses of smell. I can see it. We experience it with my eyes, but we have other senses we don't really often think about, the vestibular sense and the proprioception sense, which is stuff that we don't really fully experience. We do, but you don't really even know you're experiencing it until you experience it out of balance. A vestibular, like if someone ever got vertigo, then you know you have a vestibular sense, but until you get vertigo, you don't realize that you do. But a person, you know, even if someone likes hugs or they like massages, if a person's having a meltdown, it's not the time, because it's adding more information for their body to filter out that they may not be able to process. So it's just going to compound it. And oftentimes, you know, parents will say, well, why can't they self-soothe? And it's actually not that they can't self-soothe, it's that there's more compounding stuff we're doing in order to like make it worse for them. So let's just take a step back. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think self-soothing and stimming and all that kind of stuff, absolutely, to prevent a meltdown, absolutely do everything you can to prevent a meltdown, and in sensory overload to prevent it going to a meltdown, absolutely. But it's almost like once you've hit meltdown, that's it. You're at doomsday. You're done. You just got to see it through. And like I say, I'm very close to my autistic brother, and that's really interesting for me because he can be having a meltdown, and my kind of maternal sisterly instinct just wants to hug him and tell him everything's going to be okay, and you know, you're having a meltdown, and I promise you it's going to be okay when you come out the other end of it. But me being autistic is saying you gotta let him just see this through. If you go up to him, he's going to push you away, and you're going to make it worse. You're not going to help him by, like you say, giving him more information to deal with. So I know what it's like, and you feel like you're doing a bad thing by leaving your child in distress. But if they're safe and they're comfortable, the thing I always say is just, you know, maybe sit in the room with them, but sit in the corner, and they're almost like they're feeling attacked, and you need to make them realize that you are not a further attack on that. You are a safe space, and you're going to stay there and be with them until they are ready to kind of engage with you.
Yeah, and that's fantastic advice. And I really hope that parents watching this, like, it's going to be hard to do, but it is the best thing for sure. I like how you talk about like stimming, and I do want to talk about that for a second. So I'm a behaviorist. Most people who work with behaviorists think about behaviorists as being against stimming. And that held true for a really long time, for many decades. That is what the majority of the belief of people was. And I don't think that always holds true today. Certainly in my case, I do allow children to stim. I think it's an important thing for that child. It's something we don't fully understand. We think that kids do it because it's fun for them, but like you said, oftentimes there's not a choice. And just like a person's oftentimes not even aware of it. So I always say, like, okay, anytime you prevent a child from stimming, it's going to come at a cost. And that cost, the child is specifically the one paying that cost. And the child is the only one paying that cost. And there's times when you have to do that, right? If a child is engaging in a stimming behavior that's dangerous, you have to keep a child safe. So I've seen situations where children will bang their head against the wall. And obviously that's dangerous, right? That's an extreme example, but it's one that I have seen on many occasions, not just once. I've seen a lot of kids do that. You have to stop that, right? There's no way, under no way in which one could say that the child has the right to bang their head against the wall, they have the right to stim. That's not, you have to stop that, right? They could get hurt, they could get killed that way, they can get a concussion, they can do brain damage. That has to be intervened with. And if you have a child who pulls people's hair, that's children like that tactile simulation. That's another one. I've seen this pretty common. Or children who eat things that are not, I've seen children do things like eating string, eating hair, eating small objects. This can cause serious problems. It can even cause death, right? You have to stop that. You can't let someone pull someone's hair down the street. So you have to intervene, obviously, when it comes to those stimming. And then there are the other thing is when someone engages in stimming and it's so disruptive to the people around them that they can't really be in social situations, like, for example, going to movies, going to a dinner. Because no parent, and I think no autistic person, would want to be the reason someone else couldn't enjoy a meal, for example, at a restaurant. So there's this balance. And sometimes it's really hard to find, depending upon the child, of when is it okay to allow a person to stim, and when do you have to intervene? And there's the obvious answers. Like, right, the obvious answer is someone's banging their head, you have to intervene. And then there is the kid who jumps up and down and flaps their hands when they're watching Paw Patrol because they really love that show. And it's really exciting. And the truth is they're not harming or causing any distress to anybody. They're in their own home and they're excited, and that's how their brain is processing excitement at the moment. But then you have them, that's maybe that same child, and you go to a restaurant and maybe the family is unable to stay in the restaurant because the child is doing the exact same thing in the restaurant, and now he's disrupting everybody around him. And then we would say, okay, well, now it's not socially acceptable anymore. So it's not always black and white, and the balance is not always hard to find. And like you said earlier, you said very well, Rosie, that that's one of the hardest parts of being a parent, of parenting a child that's autistic, is knowing the difference between when is it okay, when is it a meltdown, when is it not. With the stimming, when is it okay, when is it not okay? And that's a question that I think is not easy, especially for someone who's a behaviorist like myself. Like I said, I was classically told, no, never, it's never okay. You know, classically 10, 15 years ago, the goal of behavior therapy was to make someone not autistic anymore. That was the goal. That was our job. So all the autistic looking behaviors had to stop. So we were told if the kid stims, no, you can't stim. Why? Because people will know you have autism. Today, we don't do that, right? If people should know someone's autistic, because it means they get the accommodations they require to be successful. But for you, in your opinion, you know, where is that balance? Because it is such a crucial part of neurology for someone who's autistic. But where do you draw that balance?
I think, again, it's important, you know, as an autistic person, like, so my special interest is Harry Potter, and I'm 20 years old, and if somebody randomly says Harry Potter, I'm quite likely to start clapping or getting excited. If I suppressed that, it would be a huge part of me trying to not enjoy that moment. Like, I've had it before where Harry Potter's mentioned in the office, and I go to stim, and no, you can't do that here. And it's not a nice feeling, because you think your instinctive, you know, you guys might smile, my physical reaction is to clap, and somehow that's not okay. but just because all of you guys smile and laugh, that's okay. Like it's our instinctive reaction. I mean, I don't know how I can tell on this me slightly spinning, but there's no way I could sit still and do this interview. So if slightly spinning enables me to do it, I spin in the office quite a lot. It's not hurting anybody. It's not, do you know what I mean? It helps me focus. But obviously I do accept that there are, I've said to mum with my little brother, my personal opinion is if he's not breaking anything, he's not hurting himself or anybody else, behavior that he needs to do to get through a meltdown or stimming, I don't see a problem with it. But that's the 3 rules I would do. Yes, it gets a bit harder when you're in social situations. I don't have the self-esteem to stim in front. I wouldn't click in the office or clap in the office. I'm trying to get better at it. I think you can take stims and try and re-divert them, if that makes sense. So whereas at home I'd have a fidget toy, I wouldn't take that to the office, but I do wear a hairband on my wrist, which you can get away with being a lot more socially acceptable to fidget with a hairband than I could to take a tangle into the office. So I think you can find ways to try and re-divert the natural stim and find one that still feels natural to them, but maybe slightly more okay. Not that you should try and change to fit it in, but I wouldn't have the confidence to sit with fidget toys in the office, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I know that oftentimes it takes a toll on an autistic person, that pressure to always feel like they're fitting in. And the pressure to feel like things that are natural, like you said earlier, are not okay. And that's really hard because I think every time that you're modifying your behavior to please other people, you're denying part of who you are. And so oftentimes people watch this show, they don't understand why they require accommodating other people's needs and other people's behaviors. But I think that if people understood what that really meant and really understood the emotional and physical toll it took on somebody, that they would be more willing and more accepting. So if you're open to sharing it, for you, what is the cost for you when you deny who you are, like you said, in the workplace? What does that cost you, like really cost you?
So for me, I paid, well, I'd say the ultimate price on the other, but a huge price. So after getting into the workplace first year, and so I had the autism diagnosis, and my very well thought through plan was to outrun autism and to still be able to do everything everybody else could do, to the point where I was working 13-hour days. I was going home, I wasn't eating, I was just falling asleep in my suit. I was going back to work having panic attack after panic attack, sensory overload. I was self-harming. It was absolutely horrendous. But for a long time, I thought I was beating the system because I was doing what everybody else was doing, and I was holding down a full-time job, and I thought I was winning, until one morning I woke up and I couldn't walk. So my right leg, quite literally, I couldn't lift it. It couldn't move. It got worse and worse. I ended up both legs being in horrendous pain. I couldn't walk properly. I had 6 months of horrible tests while they looked into things like MS and ALS and all these horrible things. And it turned out that what happened was I had pushed myself so hard that essentially my mind and body had snapped, and it said, no, you're not doing that anymore. I'm going to find a way to slow you down. And it did. It quite literally did. And I had to move jobs because the doctor said, you can't do this anymore. You can't try to be like everybody else at the massive cost of your health. And I realized that nothing was worth my health, not trying to appear not autistic, not trying to hold down a job, nothing. And I actually ended up then going to a firm that did accommodate me, did really try to create an environment that I thrived in. And I'm no longer paying, I'm still in pain because I paid the price, but I'm no longer putting myself through so much. I started writing when I started my new job. I got a quality of life back. I started eating tea again. Everything started to fall into place when I fitted into an environment that suited my needs instead of desperately trying to fit into one that was just never going to work for me.
Yeah, and I am so grateful that you shared that. I know that must have been really hard to share because it's so deeply personable. And so I want to just congratulate you on being vulnerable, and that's hard for everybody. So the fact that you had the courage to do that, I hope it helps other people. because I hope that people watching this will know now, next time you see somebody who's maybe stimming, maybe you're riding the same train as them and they're watching their phone and they're watching a video, and as an adult they're making noises, and maybe you're tired and maybe you don't really want to hear it, you don't think you should have to. Understand what that person stopping would really do, right? The reality of it is that most of the time, if we have to modify our behavior to accommodate someone who's different, it might be a minor inconvenience, right? That's the reality. It might be a minor inconvenience, but there's really very little cost we have to pay. But by asking the other person to modify their behavior, the cost is much, much greater. And I really hope that people watching this are a lot more accepting and are able to really, truly understand, it's a lot easier for society to accommodate the needs of people that are different than to ask people who are different to be like everybody else. So, thank you so much for coming on here and just sharing your story. I've really learned a lot from you. I was deeply touched by who you are. And I think that just having had this conversation, it made me a better professional and just a better person. And, I, like everyone, I'm guilty of at times, just not being in my best place. And I think everyone experiences the moments where they get in a place of judgment and they want their needs met above everybody else's. And so you inspired and humbled me today to be more careful about that. And I hope that everybody else watching this has had that same experience.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I advocate for, is just to stop and try and think, why is this person doing this? What is the reason behind it? And just perspective, isn't it? That's the biggest thing, is to challenge your perspective. I think everybody is going to be better for that.
Yeah. And I know that I know initially you were concerned about even being able to fill this time slot. And actually, I wish we could keep talking, but because this does play on public access television, I have to keep it under 30 minutes. I made a promise to them. So we do have to close. But is there any final words you want to just say to anybody, any parting advice you want to give anyone who's watching this?
I would just say to learn off of everybody, especially within the autism community. We all bring something to the table, whatever that is. If we can learn from each other, we will all be better for it, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Could not agree more and couldn't have said it any better. So thank you again, Rosie, for being on the show. If you tuned in halfway through, my name is Jessica Leichtweisz. I'm the CEO of Hope Education Services. This has been an episode of Bridge the Gap. If you want to be on this show, head over to my website, hopeeducationservices.com. If you're a parent watching this and you have a child who's autistic, there's a lot of resources on that website to help you to really understand your child better and just create a better outcome for your family. If you want to see more of these replays, this is a show that I do every week. Head over to my YouTube channel and you can catch all the replays there. The URL for that is getautismanswers.com. Thank you again, everyone who's tuned in. Thank you, Rosie, and we will see you next week on Bridge the Gap.